Hi, folks. You're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining this radio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about a question that's come up a few times, and that is, how did Britain do so very well economically out of the wars with France and Spain, and even Holland, from probably even starting in the mid 1500s, but particularly kicking off from the early 1700s into the early 1800s, into the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Britain did tremendously well. So all the expenditure of the war and the military cost of the whole thing, they were able not only to sustain those expenditures, but come out of it stronger than ever, having done better than ever before. Now, contrast this in the later wars in the 20th century, in the 1914-18 war with Germany, and again in 1939 to 1945. Britain did economically quite badly in both of those, and a once mighty nation and empire that was preeminent in all matters of world affairs went from being number one to really being a second tier or a second-rate power quite quickly. Even though it technically at least had won both of those wars, it was financially and spiritually, I think, exhausted by them, and had achieved nothing, had gained nothing, had got nothing from those conflicts. You've got to wonder why Britain bothered to engage in those wars when they were quite fruitless and would have been seen as so by many, I think, at the outset. Was it an outmoded view about Britain's role in the world and in Europe that had passed its use by date, but the British government was still incorrectly applying in a geopolitical sense? But let's have a look at it now. When Spain became the richest country in really the wider European sphere, at least during the 1500s, because of its South American empire, particularly the gold and silver that it was getting. The Spanish king was also what was called the Habsburg, like Holy Roman Emperor, and which brought in vast lands under the control of the Spanish king, but also vast expenditures. For example, this was the time of the Protestant Reformation and things like that. So the Spanish king had to maintain large armies on almost a permanent basis around Europe, which was hugely expensive and drained the resources. In fact, it ended up bankrupting the Spanish and turning them into a second-rate power in the end. But as part of the wider Habsburg Empire, the modern-day Holland and Belgium was controlled by the Spanish, and the Dutch were fighting a war of independence, and were quite good at it and quite effective. So that meant again that the Spanish king had to place vast military resources in the area to try and quell that, as they would see it, a rebellion. And that was very expensive to maintain. But the British were doing quite well. They were starting to colonize the Americas themselves, or the Caribbean rather, the British pirates were, English pirates were, as all other pirates were, by the way, trying to capture the gold and silver ships that the Spanish were bringing from South America to Europe, which, by the way, was the sole source of their power. They were bringing this money in, this gold and silver in, which was going directly into funding these constant wars they were fighting, which were achieving very little. The Spanish ended up draining themselves and exhausting themselves. Also, when you've got vast amounts of unearned cash, if you like, coming into the system, it caused sort of really inflation in areas where you didn't want it. Manufacturing industries, many industries suffered in the sense that why bother making anything or producing anything when you could just grab gold and silver out of the South American mines? So So that was all coming in, and it had a very perverse and deadening effect on the Spanish economy in many ways, quite apart from the military expenditures. But the British did okay out of a lot of that, in as much as they were developing the naval capability they were designing fast ships, raiding ships, things like that. So their naval technology was moving along, and they were doing okay out of it. Also seeing how overseas empire could be very, very profitable, and how there are vast areas of land that were just simply being unused by Stone Age type natives. So who hadn't been exposed. I mean, most of these Stone Age natives hadn't even invented the wheel, for goodness sake. So they were many thousands of years in evolutionary terms behind what the white folks were doing in Western Europe or Europe. So when the wars with the French came, and by the way, England and France, or Britain and France, had always been at a state of war. A French duke from the province of Normandy had invaded England in 1066, and due to just a lucky hit, the Danes and the Norwegians had invaded England at about the same time, or just a little bit before. So the English, which would have been like an Anglo-Saxon army, had defeated the Danes. But as soon as they were congratulating themselves on that victory, word came that the French Norman Duke had landed in southern England. So they had this forced march to go south to fight another battle just after they defeated the Danes. And it was just a bit too much, a bit beyond their capacity. And in what was a very close run thing, the French Duke, William, prevailed in 1066 and then sort of conquered England in effect. And he has the name William the Conqueror. That sort of installed, like, if you like, a French elite in at the head of England, and later, Wales and so on. So the French Duke had lands in France, and quite a lot of them too, and also the Channel Islands like Jersey and Guernsey and some were also part of his domain. So when the French nationalist movement came on, they used the propaganda that this French Duke, they weren't really French at all. They were really English, and we're going to kick out the English and throw the English out, defeat the damn English, and this was the Joan of Arc type crap that was going on. So, but they weren't English at all. They were French nobility that had invaded England. So there's a constant state of simmering tension and if you like, almost civil war type conditions between the two areas. The French now owning England and also still having lands in France that the French nationalist movement was trying to take. So in the wars with the French, France was quite a big international mercantile trading empire, as was the Spanish, and of course later the Dutch when they gained independence. And there was quite a few wars that were fought between England or Britain and these other powers. Now, as Spain was sort of declining into bankruptcy, the English did quite well in grabbing various Spanish colonies or simply taking over the trading routes. The Spanish could no longer afford to run a large merchant fleet, for example. So the British were able to fill that void and go in and provide the merchant shipping that was needed to carry those goods, spices, whatever it was, around. So they benefited commercially in that sense. But also in the wars with the French and Dutch, every time the French and Dutch would be financially exhausted, and the British would still sort of be hanging in there. And so when the war ended, the British would take over various colonies. Say, okay, well, we'll take over this colony. For example, the colony of New York was New Amsterdam, and the British acquired that in a war with the Dutch. The Dutch made the mistake of, say, the British were in a war with the French. The Dutch made the regular mistake of siding with the French, and then when they lost out, they'd lose some of their colonies. Many of the Dutch and French colonies, which grew things like sugar and all sorts of produce of the day, as well as raw materials. These would fall into British hands. So the British would have all these, it would acquire through war all these additional colonies, additional trade. And, you know, at one stage, one in every two ships in the entire planet was a British ship. That's how big the British merchant fleet was, and how much they controlled of world trade, whether they controlled the trade route itself, or provided the shipping, or provided the insurance, or all the other support services, such as, because the British had so many colonies, a lot of the boat repair facilities and, you know, refurbishment facilities of recorking, you know, putting the tar in the gaps in the planks of wood that make up the ships and that sort of thing. The British had a you know, almost a stranglehold on that around many parts of the world, which all brought revenue into the empire and its colonies and so on. And if you look at the British revenues from customs duties and import duties and things like that, it was massive in relative terms, and it made Britain very rich. Now, if you put on the top of that large mercantile empire, an empire spread out, lots of raw materials coming in, and then you have the Industrial Revolution kicking off in the early 18, and really kicking off in earnest, say, you know, 1820s and 1830s, that sort of thing. Then suddenly Britain became, you know, this super productive powerhouse, where, you know, one person with a machine could produce 20, 30, 100 times what you know, artisans or other workers could do in other places or in other economies. And it really changed the way wealth was viewed and how wealth accumulated and dispersed and so on through productivity as a result of machinery. And, you know, the early machinery, of course, had no there was no electricity or anything like that. It was run by you know, water wheels and you know, animals pulling turning wheels to grind corn and wheat and grain and so on. So the early days of the Industrial Revolution were powered by, as I say, water and animal power or human power and that sort of thing. And it only later on did things like you know, gas, electricity, and so on be introduced. So we have to always put in perspective the initial Industrial Revolution was powered by you know, water and steam and the like. So it was, and by the way, you know, the invention of the boiler, being able to seal the boiler to hold high pressure, which in turn could you know, push single cylinder, you know, very crude single cylinder motors and that sort of thing. That was how the Industrial Revolution kicked off. So it was, you know, obviously very archaic in today's terms. Interestingly, the energy thing, where the idea of reducing energy because it's going to end the world and all that sort of thing, that sort of energy, you know, it's almost going back to the days of the early days of the Industrial Revolution, before electricity and gas was universally available, because that was the huge game changer that industrialized really the entire Western world in the later 1800s. So the British did very, very well out of these wars by acquiring colonies, trade routes, and again, you know, the expansion of their merchant fleet and the sundry services. But the wars, when they were fought, the British, rather than fight the French, you know, in every pitched battle, you know, there were a few like the Waterloo and in Spain and that sort of thing. Rather than meet the French in pitched battle, they preferred to subsidise other countries around Europe, you know, Prussia or anyone, you know, the Austrians, because some of these places they couldn't afford really to put a lot of troops in the field, so the British would give them subsidies in order to distract the French and weaken the French and harass the French hegemony on the continent, you know, during, for example, the Napoleonic Wars, or even during the earlier sort of, you know, Louis XIV and all that sort of thing. So so the French, while being military preeminent, couldn't fight wars on land and sea. They didn't have that sort of capacity. And as long as the British were subsidising various other countries around Europe to field armies, that the French were constantly off guard. Now, the British took the view that because Britain had a small population, about 1/3 the population of France in the day, because the British had a small population, they had to have if France was, for example, at the time, if France was in complete control of Europe, which they did try to do a number of times, or even Spain before that, if they were in complete control, then they would have the resources to build a vast navy and then come after Britain. And so the British were terrified of this. It was something, you know, deeply embedded in their psyche, that they really had to prevent that level of hegemony ever being achieved on the European continent. And that was really part of their policy for hundreds of years. And it was largely successful when they were able to pick up all these other colonies and trading routes and so on, and you know, put British finished goods in there, collect raw materials at favourable prices, and so on. So pretty much any overseas, with a couple of exceptions, overseas French colony fell into British hands. Most of the Dutch colonies did, not all, but a lot of the Spanish colonies did, and so on. So Britain did very, very well out of that. Now, when it came to the war with Germany in 1914-18 and again in 1939-45, British military prowess at the time was far less, I think, on a relative basis than it ever had been, and which was demonstrated, I think, in both those wars. The quality of British goods in terms of, you know, their metallurgy and standardization of weights and measures, all these sorts of things, were far behind Germany. Germany was well ahead in the areas of, you know, most areas of mechanical engineering, you know, high quality steel, precision made steel, you know, chemicals, in a whole range of areas, electricals. Germany was well ahead of Britain, and it showed in the quality of the, you know, the equipment they put in the field, say, you know, the long range guns and artillery, all that sort of stuff. Similarly, Germany was challenging Britain at sea with quite a decent, smaller but very professional, very well designed, you know, well put together navy. But in terms of you know, the Germans were able to inflict, relative to the casualties they suffered, inflict far more casualties on the other side than they would receive themselves on a relative basis. And because they're better quality equipment, better organisation, you know, better rail links, you know, better training of the troops, you know, the whole thing, they were just much more professional outfit. They were able to sustain a much longer war than many would have imagined. So the effect of the British blockades, for example, naval blockades, had much less effect than they maybe would have had Germany not been such an efficient engineering and production and organisational outfit. But at come the end of the war, yeah, really it was a close run thing, but without American assistance, I think the Germans would have prevailed in the First World War. It was only American assistance which allowed the British and the French to sort of hang on and prevail. But at the end of it, the British gained very little. The you know, the extra trade routes, the extra colonies, the financial benefit of those colonies, really the British gained next to nothing. Sure, they gained some colonies, but the colonies didn't deliver the sort of benefits they had got during the French wars. Now, also at that time, the American merchant fleet was much bigger than it had been. So a lot of the easy money business, you know, the low-hanging fruit, if you like, that the British had picked up in previous wars, they weren't picking up this time. So in effect, the British gained nothing by fighting that war, and what little they did gain was immaterial to anything. Not that they were finished off at that point; they were still players in the game. They were still a very serious player in the game, but only just. And but by the Second World War, the British had no stomach for the fight, or maybe a few did, but had no stomach for the fight, and were utterly incapable of resisting the German Wehrmacht war machine. It was infinitely superior to anything the British could put in the field, or any of the other combatants, for that matter. So the British were just unable to compete at the, and without American help, there's just no way they could have stopped the German war machine. So it just they didn't even have a snowball's chance. They couldn't even compete at a minimal level against the Germans there. So they lost. Again, they lost. They gained nothing in that war. No new colonies, no new trading routes, no new commercial access for British goods. Nothing. They gained nothing from that. And so in the end, those wars exhausted Britain and turned it into a second-rate power. So some ask, well, why would they fight that war? Once Hitler had successfully invaded France and was in control of all of Europe and was clearly absolute master of all of Europe, nothing opposing him there. Why didn't the British cut a deal? Hitler was a lower middle class, working class guy, and he was desperate to be treated as an equal by the elites of Europe, much as Napoleon wanted. And Napoleon was lower sort of class, regional or provincial nobility, but had the British, I don't know, it's a risk. Had the British sued for peace, the various records around the German government at times suggest Hitler would have given very generous terms, just in return for being respected as a great man. And so the British could have kept their Commonwealth and Empire and all that sort of stuff and be left unmolested, provided they didn't get in Hitler's face in Europe. Then freed from any concerns about Britain and the entire Luftwaffe and all the troops that were stationed in and around Europe and Norway and all that sort of thing. They could have all been put into the war against the Soviet Union, and that, I think, would have been pretty conclusive that the Wehrmacht would have prevailed there as well in the first 6 months of that conflict. So you can imagine a world today of how that would look. But nonetheless, had the British cut a deal there, they probably would be in a better position they are now, or better position than they were consequently at the end of the Second World War. But I don't think they've had a seat at the first table, but maybe it would only be based on German tolerance of that, I think, had they cut a deal. But nonetheless, both those wars in the 20th century exhausted and destroyed Britain and turned it from an undisputed leader and first world preeminent power into being a second-rate power, having to ask American permission to do anything. And what a change in such a short space of time. Now, part of that was at the end of the Second World War, the Americans had greatly overestimated Britain's commercial sort of penetration around the world, and the Americans were very keen to break up any British Empire or even the Commonwealth to reduce it to rubber stamp type status. And so, given such pressure and coercion, the British accelerated, if you like, their abandonment of empire and parts of the Commonwealth and the commercial deals they would have had with them in other circumstances in order to appease the Americans, who they owed a lot of money to. The Americans had bankrolled the war, for goodness sakes. So the British were technically bankrupt at the end of the war. And so the British had gained nothing by fighting Germany, nothing, not one thing had they gained by fighting Germany. And the Germans may very, very well ask, well, why did you fight us and not the Americans? And that may very well be a question that German historians may pose. But the British really weren't in a position to, the logistics of fighting a war against the Americans would have been impossible. So that was off the table. The reason for fighting a war against Germany, to prevent Germany from becoming preeminent in Europe, was, well, sure, but have you got the means to do it? And the British clearly didn't. So why fight a war when you got no chance of enforcing your wishes under any circumstances. The French didn't want a war, didn't want to fight in 1939. The British didn't. The resources they had were roughly equivalent to what the Germans had. The Germans were just much better at it, much better at warfare. You know, their use of tanks and striking armor columns, that sort of thing, was way ahead of its time. Not that they weren't, British or even French military analysts. They hadn't thought about it, but it was the Germans that put it into devastating military effect. And it was done, if you look at it in terms of the relative competence of the combatants, the Wehrmacht was just streets ahead of all its competitors, and did a first class job of. I mean, it's almost textbook military application for decisive military outcome, and even is studied today as being, in the same way that Hannibal's victory over the Romans at Cannae is studied as being one of the great examples of military prowess. So the British were just couldn't play that game. The navy they had didn't have the same clout as it had in the previous wars. It was susceptible to submarines, susceptible to airstrikes, these sorts of things. So the application of naval power that they otherwise could have applied, they could no longer do it. And so that once decisive card couldn't be played with the same devastating effect that it once was, and so on and so forth. So that's the reason for the difference anyway in the outcomes. People have asked, well, how come the British did so well out of the French wars but did badly out of those wars with Germany? That's the reason why. In my view, they should have, I mean, this is hindsight, obviously, but in my view, the British should have reached an accommodation with Germany of some sort, and in that way would still be at least a bigger player at the table than they are today. You've been a Tassers today at Your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.